So what was interesting is if you look at, I was looking at Jared Diamond's book Collapse. Do you know about this? So,
He's the author of Jones' Sticky.
yeah. So,
is this all a sequel?
I don't know, I thought it was quite famous, this book, maybe it isn't. But anyway, basically what he argues is that some societies in their past damaged the environment, and we can learn from them to protect our environment now. And one of the examples he looks at is Easter Island. And this has been very controversial, because what he said was that in Easter Island you had the great statues, the people with long ears, that what they did was they wrecked their environment, yeah, and by wrecking their environment, this kind of gives us, I think I've left it, I think I managed to leave the quote, but basically, oh yeah, here it is. So I could read you this bit. Jared Diamond's Collapse is a best-selling environmental history book, a popular rather than academic work. It's reading, you know. It's nonetheless well referenced and draws upon a wider literature. So he talks about these various things. The most controversial has been Easter Island. He argues that historical and archaeological evidence suggests that once lushly forested but extremely remote Pacific island was wrecked by over-exploitation. He notes, I've often asked myself, why did the Easter Islanders who cut down the last palm tree, what did the Easter Islander who cut down the last palm tree say while he was doing it? Maybe it was a woman, I don't know, but anyway. Like modern loggers, did he shout, jobs not trees, or technology will solve our problems, never fear, and we'll find a substitute for wood? Now that's all very well and good and fine, I'd agree with that. But if you actually look at the record, it's much more complex. You know, it's much more complex than just saying the Easter Islanders didn't think of the future and wrecked their environment. So one of the kind of debates is some people said that the reason why the forest disappeared was that rats were introduced to the island and those destroyed the trees. He's also been criticised for saying that they wrecked their environment so much they became cannibals, and the indigenous people in Easter Island now are very critical of this view that they cannibalised each other. And it was also pointed out that as it's in the seas...
Sorry, can I just point out that you really do need to give people a chance to say something sort of as you go along. But also what I really noticed when I came in was that you're both sitting there with plastic bottles of water.
That's my fault.
Yeah. I think that is absolutely...
I think the lifestyle
can be
quite disgusting, actually.
Yes.
You said that's disgusting.
Well, we recycle our plastic.
Right.
I did look
Okay,
for glass vessels, you can't.
I mean, I'm almost with lifestyle. I'm always doing deliberately unecological things. I think sometimes people, they're so concerned about the individual stuff that they're not thinking of the bigger picture. So maybe that's a little bit too extreme. But you know, I'm quite angry that people in Colombia are being killed. I'm more angry about that than water bottles.
Just a little bit, yeah.
But possibly I should stop and let you come
There is
back.
actually no more practical way of storing the water, is there?
Come on.
So what wind up? So basically, he's very environmental doom and gloom. There's also the very we don't have to worry about it. The market will sort it out. And my kind of story on this is, you know, if we think carefully, there are ways of being ecological. Stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. So open floor. Obviously, there's sort of three sections, but also as a continuous story. But come in where you like on that.
Yeah, it's just that last year I was in Bolivia, and there was an event there which is actually summed up quite what you said. It's the great revolt of the indigenous people in Titis, which is a forest area. And it's quite interesting because it's about the conflict of Latin America itself, because it boils down that the Brazilians want to drive a road right across to the Pacific Ocean in order they can export what is it they grow?
Coffee? Palm.
No. It's to export directly to the Pacific coast in order to export it to China. Anyway, that's not an important thing. They could move the road by 168 kilometres to actually avoid this, but of course couldn't be done. But the story is absolutely amazing because this very small group of indigenous people decided they're going to walk to La Paz, And on walking to La Paz, they started this march. Got attacked by the police. The police arrested all the leaders and put them into an airport and were going to fly them back. But it was so outraged, the populations around, they surrounded the airport and stopped the police from actually deporting them. Also, what then happens is that the urban areas they're going to go through start to suddenly realise that this is absolutely dreadful, start to organise reception committees, and by the time they eventually got to La Paz, there was massive demonstrations. And the basic thing is this: one is, since the 202 and 203 uprising against the dictatorships, the introduction by Mas, the government party, and by Morales into the constitution were the basic rights of indigenous people to be consulted about what, if anything's going to happen. Not that nothing would happen, but they would actually be consulted in order that they could actually get some advantage. And this was completely swept away in order to actually accommodate, you know, the sub-imperialism of Brazil. But the reaction of the populations, you know, the unity, the solidarity shown by the urban population, you know, got no advantages from, you know, indigenous rights, you know, because it was an attack on the constitution, was absolutely splendid. It's a brilliant article written by some obscure chap in the Socialist Review of last month.
Oh, your good stuff.
Yeah, and a snotty note reply by someone. That's probably quite good. But basically, I think what you're really arguing, I'm going on too long, is that when it comes to actually defending the environment, what you have to raise is the whole question of democracy, the whole question of control. And that is, I think, quite an important battle, because that's the way in which we actually can defeat the government over the National Health Service, which is actually a modern piece of common, isn't it?
Yeah. Tim?
Yeah, I kind of been a bit worried about a lot of what you said. Not because I disagree with you. No, don't worry about it. Because I think kind of the notion of collective thinking is something which, I mean, I just feel people are bombarded with 24/7 individualism lifestyle. So I almost think that, like, the culture we've got, there is these people who obviously got vested interests, and they are the biggest multinationals in the world, and they're controlling and they're burning the planet. But again, I think Marx said the ruling idea is the ruling class, and those are permeated way beyond the boardrooms of Exxon, and you know, the desire for people to get the latest gizmo. It doesn't even matter where it is, and also like to poo-poo the kind of idea about collectivity. You know, rioters are demonised, they're called feral, you know, they're given huge sentences for stealing one bottle or whatever. You know, I just feel,
plastic bottles.
you know, I just kind of feel that I think ideology and the permeated kind of consumerism lifestyle thing, I'm sure it's changed over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. You know, when we think of like the kind of stuff on the telly that just wouldn't have worked, I don't think, 20, 30 years ago. And I think that's an environmental, political and social problem, really. It reunites, you know, the green agenda with, you know, all sorts of social issues. And I kind of think that nut has got to be cracked somehow. And so, you know, of course, you know, we support, you know, all the stuff about windmills and wave and turbines and, you know, all that. But there's a kind of argument in people's heads that a lot of people have, you know, put their head in the sand. And I feel, I don't like to say it really, but I feel people are really brainwashed, and I just don't know, I'm not quite sure of the way forward. I feel rather pessimistic because of the power of the media.
Did you read the article in the Guardian magazine about trainers?
No.
Very good.
Yeah.
Brainwashing and consumerism and stuff. Anybody else?
Well, if I could just very quickly echo that point, I'll probably come back with something else if I may. But I'm surprised, Derek, that as an economist you didn't touch explicitly at any one point on values. Now, it seems to me that one of the things that one can assert very, very strongly from an economic point of view is that in the West in particular, the States and ourselves, people's values have been distorted so greatly that I would assert that well over 90% of people would not really go to bed and not sleep thinking that they're not living sustainably. One of the reasons why they wouldn't allow that to keep them awake is that they would be trying to buy a better, bigger plasma television screen than their next door neighbour. And that's the set of values. And I mean, I've seen a local politician who lives on the north half of this world expound that that is the values that he as a politician should be seeking to meet. And only a few days ago, as I was getting my conservatory finished, a real eager beaver dynamic chap with 2 kids who knows that the planet is threatening his kids still wants to earn as many megabucks as he could so he could go on holidays to the other side of the planet and he admits and be bored out of his mind. But he does that essentially, I think, for prestige reasons. Values.
All right. Anybody?
All interested? I'll just keep it coming.
Do you want to respond to those first?
No, I'm thinking I'm going to plead guilty to talking for too long, but I'm innocent of the water bottles. But I think let's keep going.
Come back.
I've got quite a large television.
I've just got rid of my telly, but I've got some of the calendars taken under Regis Road, so I live in Camden, that's where the recycling is. No, I mean, there's just some...
But I live in essentially a large wooden box, I'm like trailer tracks, that's quite
there's a couple of things that I'm sort of reading currently. One is The Secret Life of Stuff. I think the author's name is Julie Hill. Hill anyway, I'm not sure of the first name, in which she sort of, examines, where things come from, where our possessions come from, and where they go when we throw them away. The other thing which is of interest, probably, am I the only woman here?
You are now. Because this man went on too long.
Yeah, no, well, you see, the thing is that one of the things I do is I have a small craft business, and I knit sort of designer garments, which are actually quite expensive. I won't go into that now. But I'm doing a stall in London Bridge on Saturday. Anyway, the serious one about this, someone's written a book called, it was Lucy Siegel, but I think might be The Observer, on environmental topics. Is fashion wearing out the world? And about how cheap fashion is actually produced, and how not just, I mean, starting with the people who actually sew the garments in Vietnam and Bangladesh, and how they're not only they're badly paid, that they're actually forced to work in sort of really, even unhygienic, unsanitary conditions for very low wages, and for very long hours, and some of them they don't even get enough to eat. But the way, for instance, the way the cotton is produced in Uzbekistan, for instance, the rivers and the sea are drying up because cotton is a very sort of intensive, water-intensive production. So the way textiles are actually produced, and so I mean, and the end product. Why can you buy stuff in Primark that's so cheap? And it's because of the sort of the chain of exploitation, of the people who actually produce it, not the people who design it, but the people who make it. You see, and then how the actual, whether it's synthetic fibres which produces strain on the environment, or whether it's, I say, unless you have organic cotton, cotton is apparently the actual process of producing cotton causes a lot of environmental degradation. And I think that quite often we don't think, as you say, if we want to sort of mega plasma telly, we don't actually think of all the processes by which we get stuff, and then we don't think about what happens when we finish with it. When we chuck it away. It's just something that it's all connected to us. And you see, the thing is, what I do, I make stuff out of organically produced yarn, wool or silk, or mixtures of wool and silk. But it's expensive, you see. Who can afford to buy my stuff? But the stuff I use, some of the yarn I use is hand spun by Women's Cooperative in Uruguay. But then on the other hand, there's all the air miles involved in getting it to Europe, you see. So, so there is a problem with the sort of cheap fashion that everybody can afford, you know, are people entitled to that? But on the other hand, the actual sort of cost, environmental and human cost of producing cheap goods sort of negates the cheapness of them. Whatever, just three thoughts anyway.
Do you want to come back on anything so far? Because we're going to lose the thread.
Yeah, I've got lots of kind of interesting stuff, really. I'm slightly conscious I could go on for hours now, so I try and argue with people about water bottles, really. It's just like, you know, we've got this fucking planetary crisis, and sometimes the ways people approach it are just so trivial. And okay, I don't really want to condemn people about being concerned with water bottles, because important it is to be concerned by them. But, you know, we've got to change our culture and our economy. And also, in a sense, it's another, there's danger, I mean, I'm sounding like very, very harsh in it, but it's, again, part of the sort of individualism, that you do everything as an individual. And what, you know, basic thing, even without talking about this kind of stuff, is, you know, if we had good public transport, then it's easier to use less fuel. You know, it's not even whether people want cars or don't want cars or something, but if you've got like good, cheap alternatives, you know, so I think there is a danger about it becoming some kind of puritanical religion where you suffer. Yeah, I mean, I generally think so, and I do green lifestyle stuff. It's mainly growing my food and cycling, which I find quite enjoyable. And, you know, I wish I could find some non-violent way of flying around the world and seeing my friends, but anyway, that's got to me too much. I can get back and argue about it. I mean, the Latin American stuff is interesting, complex, but pretty much even the worst Latin American left governments are a lot better than the kind of left alternatives that we generally have here. And it's also, I think, a tell on the whole of optimism, because the indigenous people are very, very strong. And you go back 15 years ago, and it's like the right has won, consumerism is in, and you've seen really big changes in Latin America. You know, I do agree with the kind of culture thing, because what happens is you have like an economy and you have rules and regulations, and then it becomes so internalised, you could take the rules and regulations away and people would still do the same thing. And there's been the Thatcher revolution to make us more greedy and selfish and not to think that you can do other things. And, you know, of course, it's such a massive thing for the Liberal Democrats and the Tories really to close libraries down and marketise the NHS, because it's like sacrilege that anything isn't buying and selling in market mechanisms. And, you know, there is like a whole society, and it shapes us. You know, Marx talks about the formal and real subsumation of labour, which is a bit of a mouthful. But, you know, you had to kind of force people into the factories and off the land in a violent way, but eventually people become more socialised to their roles. You know, I'm certainly not saying workers have been passive, but we get socialised into a role, and then we don't need to be kind of forced and cajoled, because we take on that consumerism rather than community. And to me, the kind of job of politics is that you've always got to kind of take territory, come up with new rules, design new kind of architectures, and get kind of change. You know, so the focus has got to be in whatever tiny way you can to get, you know, politically involved. And I don't mean purely party political, so that you can kind of take a bit of territory, try and change some rules, get a bit more space. And Deleuze and Guattari, who I said to be unreadable, so I've never read them, but I know they talk about territorialisation and deterritorialisation. So what that is you literally rewrite rules. So Europeans went into the Americas and deterritorialised the empires and how the indigenous works, and imposed new rules. So to me, the kind of green politics, the kind of fundamental thing is, how do you re-territorialise? How do you come up with new rules? And there's a fight for this all the time. So certainly the NHS, certainly the way the web works. So amongst the slight pessimism about consumerism, free, anonymous,